Today we're putting in the front brake package on this car behind me. If you've been paying attention to this build, you know that this Twin Spark 75 is going in this car. Now the Twin Spark 75 that we're putting in this car is going to be somewhere in the area of 220, maybe even 225 horsepower, possibly a little bit more than that, but we'll find out what the dyno tells us a little bit later. But for now we're talking about the ability to control the car. Okay, so in this particular case, we are changing the front brake package to an upside setup. We're going with the Alfaholics 4-piston brake setup. Okay, so here's their 4-piston brake setup. It's not only lighter than the stock units, but it has better grabbing capabilities. Now, I'm not saying that the original Alfa brakes weren't good. In fact, they're superior in many ways to a lot of brakes that were out there. But here is the stock 2-liter brake pad. Now you think about the piston that sits behind this, that's pushing this pad, is almost dimensionally the same size as this, okay? So it puts an awful lot of force and very focused energy. Here is the Frodo racing brake pad for these. Now your principles are the same, except for you have two different pistons pushing down on this. You're distributing the load over a wider surface. You're increasing your braking capabilities, and because you have a slotted and vented rotor, like we do here, slotted and vented, your ability to cool off these brakes is vastly improved over the stock solid brake. So with that said, you know, there's a few things we're going to go over as we're assembling this. Now, when we reassembled this front end, we went ahead and sent out the spindles and had them powder coated. So now that they're back and on the car, we need to polish the surface of the spindle. That's this area right here. We need to polish the surface of the spindle and make sure it's contamination free, because you have to figure that not only is the brakes important, but the bearings are equally important. You think about this for a second. How many times have you had in your Alfa where you had to push it and it feels like it's rather resistant? Well, you're human. The motor is the same way. The motor takes a lot of energy to overcome that resistance as well. So if it's time to do up the brakes on your car, not necessarily upgrade into a package system, but at least change the bearings, there's a few things you should think about. One, get all the grease off. Yeah, I know it's a nasty, messy situation, but get all the grease out of the bearings that you have and off of the spindle and redo that. And when you do that, make sure you're not using just a standard moly grease. This is kind of a common mistake. This stuff is not high temp resistant. You need to go with a high temp disc brake bearing grease. This does make a difference, okay? So we're going to be using this. I'll show you how to pack bearings in a little bit, but this is kind of a no-brainer. You can't take the grease factor very lightly. The right grease for the right job. that we have the hub basically on the car, and the backside bearing has been pre-greased and ready to go. That's why you didn't see me do it. But here's the fronts, okay? So when you're putting grease, it's not just coating the outside. You have to literally roll it into the inside and pack the backside of the bearing first. When you see it start to squeeze through the inside of the needles, then you know you have effectively gotten that side coated. So that only means that the backside of the bearing is coated. You really don't want a dry spot on these, because though it will instantly lube itself, even just the most subtle of wear-in can shorten the life of them. Okay, so now that I got all the backsides packed, again using disc brake grease, now I'm going to go ahead and start pushing it right through the front. I'm not going to wipe any of this off because I want to be able to maximize the overall bearing lube, okay? And yeah, you can wear gloves and whatnot, but you know, whatever. You're going to be getting your hands greasy no matter what, so I don't worry too much about it. Now the inside receiver area, I also like to make sure I get plenty of it packed inside there as well. Now that right now is one very heavily coated bearing. Okay, so now we're going to feed that in there. And waste not, have not. Alright, so now put one last little layer on the surface of the retainer, just so it doesn't have a dry rub to it as well. Line it up to the notch. Alright. Put that on there. Okay, so the hub isn't actually fully seated up against the spindle yet. It's on there far enough, but I don't want to sit there and keep banging it and potentially damage the freshly paint on the actual hub. So as long as you got enough threads to get it going, just cranking down the nut will help seat it equally and also help all the bearings kind of pack themselves in there much better. You can't really see it, but the hub is starting to sink down pretty good. Rotate it a little bit before you do any final snug downs and pinning this. You'll feel the bearings go for almost like a dry rubbing effect to starting to coat themselves really well. Okay. Coming up in a near soon episode, we're going to be using ceramic bearings. Ceramic bearings at the fill have a real coarse texture feel to them, but once they're in place, they have such a smooth roll that it's actually considered putting horsepower back to the car, because it's less resistance effort that the motor has to overcome to roll down the street. And this is something, if you think about it, when you push a car around, it feels like you really got to do a lot of work to push a car. That is also something your motor has to overcome as well. So good bearings, good grease, very important. Alright, that's pretty good. Okay, so we got pretty good rollability out of this. Don't want it too fast, but you definitely don't want a lot of resistance on that bearing either. So now that we have the nut torqued down just about where it should be, I'm going to put in a new card pin. There's actually a textbook way of doing this. What you do is you're supposed to slide the pin in through like so. Now most of us, what we do is we split it and we wrap around the nut. Believe it or not, the textbook way of this is a little bit different than that. So what you're supposed to do is get all of it in, get the brake on it, just like that, and then bring it back towards the center of the spindle. Bring it back as both pieces as one. Then, once it's there, the center hole there, you're supposed to take this, line it up to it. You're supposed to distort it like that. Okay, so now we're going to put the caliper on. When you put these on, I know this seems common sense to a lot of folks, but maybe not for everybody. The bleeder ports, make sure they're pointing up, because it is easy enough to put them on the downside. So make sure the bleeder ports are up. Okay. Alright, so if you're going to order a set of these, make sure that you have the appropriate adapter plate for whatever spindle you have. Now, we put a 2-liter front end on this car, so we needed the 2-liter spindles. The thing of it is if you have a 1600, you need to let them know that, because you're going to have the 1600 adapters for the brakes, okay? So, continuing on with our theme of what we're doing, the hardware that bolts that caliper on there, we're going to put a little anti-seize on it. Alright, you don't need to get crazy with the coatings. A little bit on that one as well. Alright. And bring them over here. We have our washers waiting for us. Put these down. Now, I don't put the pads in until after the caliper's on, because it makes it a little easier to assemble the system. So now these are kind of resting in place. I want to talk about one other thing. These kits come with their own ports for brake lines. We typically don't use these, because I end up using what's called a banjo fitting instead. And banjo fitting is basically the same exact thing. It's on your carburetors that wrap around that bolt with the hole through it. That's what we use on these. The reason we do that is because when you have a greater volume potential of fluid on the piston, you tend to get less brake negative fade or feed from the brake pedal, and the brakes themselves actually get a more stable amount of fluid pressing against them. So though there's nothing wrong with the type of hardware that comes with it for the brake lines, I would encourage you to think about using the banjo fittings instead. And it's just like using the steel braided brake lines. You use those over the rubber ones because it doesn't expand, so you have a more consistent brake capability. That's the same thing the banjo fitting does. It gives you the more consistent brake capability. Absolutely a must on a race car. It's the first time this car has been on the ground in over a year. It's probably actually even closer to 2 years. Some of you are looking at this color going, yeah, I don't know. But even more of you are looking at this car and its color selection going, wow, that's really cool. The owner has really good ideas of what he wanted to do with this, and I got to give him credit for staying focused up to this point exactly what he wanted. So we have the Alcoholics big brake package, and we have the Alcoholics 15-inch wheels on here. The only difference is we painted these wheels this color to kind of work with our current theme. You gotta admit, it looks pretty cool.